chemicals, nitrogen, phosphorus, fresh water, land, biodiversity, air pollution, ozone pollution, right? So this is like a new image. This is how do we get inside the donut into what Kate calls a safe and just space for humanity, and maybe a new vision of a regenerative and distributed economy. Because one thing I know for sure is that every nation on the earth is trying to achieve social thresholds through one goal, right? Economic growth. Grow the economy, right? All the problems that a growing economy creates, we solve them by growing the economy. All the shortfalls that we see on health and housing and even equality can be solved by growing the economy. Higher incomes, more stuff, more consumption, more. This suggests that if we do this in the current mindset, the current model, we're going to continue to blow past these boundaries. So this kind of image of a donut, Kate Raworth and her team has created the Donut Economics Action Lab. She's been working at city scales. We decided to adopt something like this in Vermont. Work in Vermont at a state scale, right? The state of, 620, 630,000 people is, a whole state's the size of like a small city, right? So like, could we imagine setting targets within the floor of the donut and the ceiling of the donut and answer this question of how do all Vermonters live well? Some of that might be changing some expectations, right? How do all Vermonters live well, but within our means, right? Within the means of the living planet. So this has sort of become the sort of new radar diagram, if you will, for the Sustainable Development Agenda, the Sustainability Agenda, the imagining a sustainable future, which is what I think we're supposed to be wrestling with in this class, right? One imagination of the sustainable future is like, how do we get humanity inside the donut? And all the evidence points that many people and places are inside here. Many folks that have met minimal thresholds for this are doing so by blowing past these planetary boundaries. So we've got a little bit of a runway for this in Vermont. About 12 years ago, Vermont passed Act 113 with the help of UVM students in classes like this. We crunched the data, we did the numbers. We took this national indicator called the Genuine Products Indicator, which comes from ecological economics, and applied it to the state, pitched it to the legislature, went through all the hearings and all that sort of thing, and passed this into law. And this was meant to sort of create a new indicator, because Vermont, just like every other state in the country and every other nation in the world, measures the health of the economic system with one indicator, the size of the pie, right? Gross domestic product, or in the case of the state, gross state product. So what this bill says is like, let's just do one small thing. Why don't we just look at the net contributions of the economy to well-being and long-term prosperity? Again, envisioning a sustainable future. Because with GDP, price times quantity of all the goods and services that we sell in a one-year time period, right? Everything's a benefit, nothing's a cost. So this at least says, let's go through the activity of counting this is a benefit and this is a cost and subtracting costs from benefits. It's like a good old-fashioned economist kind of thing to do, right? That we don't do as a nation. We don't do as a state. And then let's use this as a tool to identify public priorities. Like, let's not worry about the scale of the economy as much as the quality of the economy, right? Shift the mindset in Vermont from quantity to quality. It was like one small step. But what this bill also opened up is including other measures such as human rights, okay? What GPI does is it takes experts like me who make all kinds of heroic assumptions to do the price times quantity thing on what is the value of all those things outside of the market. Soils, water, air, climate, right? So people trained like me do this magical act of coming up with prices of things that aren't bought and sold in the markets, imputing them on things like environmental goods and services, right? And then coming up with a metric that says, in the case of Vermont, we've been growing in a way in the last couple of decades where we're creating more costs than benefits. But it's been very expert-oriented, right? I do a study, I work with some students, I publish a study each year, I present it to the legislature, job well done, right? Maybe it changes the conversation a little bit within the legislature, but does it really involve multiple agendas? Does it really help us rethink the paradigm? Does it take all those agendas around housing and income and work and equality, and climate and land biodiversity, does it kind of weave them together into a new narrative? So what we've been doing is leveraging this bill, which is very kind of technocratic, expert-oriented, and crafting something in the last year and a half called the Vermont Prosperity Project, with this goal of kind of well-being for all within the means of a living planet. And we're finding that we can take the agendas of the groups that are working on housing and the groups that are working on climate change and realize that they have root causes, right, of those two challenges. And if they work on them in their silos, they kind of work against each other's purposes. That we can take the agendas of equality and social justice, right? And we can take the agendas of a good livable income, a livable wage, and we can bring them together under the same roof using this kind of donut framework. So this has become kind of a network of networks, a weaving together of a bunch of NGOs in Vermont, Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, the Gund Institute, I'm forgetting all the groups that are part of this. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance, which is actually an international group that has a presence here in Vermont. And weaving together kind of a new narrative and under the auspices of a new prosperity. So we've been workshopping this rather than with experts, with folks who are part of these NGOs, with citizens, thinking about for Vermont, what's the inside of the donut? For Vermont, what's our share of the outside of the donut? We've been asking, we did this recently in a class of mine. We took students and took results from a citizens workshop and asked the students to put some numbers on it. What's the status of food security in Vermont? Measure it. What's the trend of food security in Vermont? Measure it. What's the goal of food security in Vermont? Measure it. Identify the gap. Put it on the radar diagram. So we've been doing, this is a big meeting in Montpelier with kind of all the executive director types of the NGOs, working with people with these donut diagrams to sort of pencil out and be specific about what would the social foundations and ecological schemes for Vermont look like, right? Thinking through all the dimensions of this, but trying to bring it back to kind of a common understanding of where we're at and a common goal of where we want to go. And when people can think 10, 20 years out, they agree way more than they disagree. When they think about like putting out the fire or the crisis of their own house or their own family or their own work life, like tomorrow, it's hard to thinking about the future. Been working a lot with Regal Melgar, who you might know is a PhD student of mine. This is a poster that we put together on some of this work of really thinking about what the Vermont donut will look like. This has helped think also about how our state university could take all the, because like people around UVM, faculty, staff, students, each work on those wedges, right? And they often do it kind of in isolation of each other. Like how could we take all of those assets of the work we do on each of the wedges of the donut and tie it to this agenda setting process in our state? So we've been using this planetary health initiative that the provost, now acting president, has launched at UVM. And we've been similarly workshopping, right? So we workshopped this last year with faculty, staff, and students in the Davis Center, thinking through the donut exercise with administrators, with faculty, with staff. A lot of our Rubenstein students were at this event, thinking through social foundations and ecological ceilings. There's our former interim dean, Alan Strong, who led a discussion on some of the work that they did at their table, and seeing if we can use this way to define what we mean by this human health and well-being work here at UVM. So that's a little bit of a taste of one of the projects that I'm involved with. It's very sort of citizens-oriented, NGO-oriented, civil society-oriented. It's taking some work that we did that was much more sort of technocratic, expert-oriented, and trying to see if we can really rethink the whole project around more of a from a bottom-up approach. How's that? Okay. They told me to talk for 20 minutes.
So let's a couple of minutes for question answer. Okay, come up with your questions. Yes, please.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, sure.
Inspiring. I'm going to sign up.
Okay.
How does, I mean, this feels like the Piedmont of the degrowth movement, or at least post-growth. I mean, because in so many ways, the contrast between the use of energy and the social goals is so unsustainable. If you're talking about a transformation, you're talking about something profoundly different from, which is what post-growth promises. Except that what you're talking about is the studied, intentional progression into post-growth. That's what it feels like to me. Just tell me.
Yeah, no, you're on the right page. The Sustainable Development Agenda that came out of the Brundtland Commission in 1987 really set forth this notion of sustainable development, but it kind of hanged on to the current systems and current goals, especially of a growing economy. And so the kind of narrative that we have amongst the United Nations and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is like, we can continue to do business as usual, we just have to be more efficient. We got to use technology and we can grow, but in a green way. All the empirical evidence shows that a couple of things, like efficiency actually leads to more impact, because the more efficient you get at something, the more you do it. That's what the data shows. The more efficiently we use energy, the more energy we use. That's what the data shows. And so a lot of this work points to, like, do we really need a new narrative? Stevens called it degrowth or post-growth, right? So this intersects with a lot of that work on questioning the growth narrative that really came out of the Great Depression era, especially how we measured growth, and rethinking, like, what are the larger goals of society, and how do we kind of create true, genuine, sometimes what we call strong sustainability that actually provides for all, but without degrading the natural environment. You had your hand up over here?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a name to the concept, the Jevons paradox.
Jevons paradox, thank you, yeah.
Which is that increased efficiency tends to lead to more use of that thing you're trying to be efficient about. It's worth looking up, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, those of us who do ecological economics know of the work of Jevons and the coal question that he was asking in the 1800s, like, why are we becoming more and more and more efficient of using coal in England, yet we're using more coal than ever? It's the same question right now with the renewable energy transition. Why are we adding more and more and more and more and more renewables, yet we're using more coal than ever, more oil than ever, more natural gas than ever, right? So this is this sort of trap that we're in right now. And then we often call it sustainability because we've become more efficient. Sustainability can't be just about efficiency. It has to be about equity, and it has to be about scale.
And what's great about the Jevons paradox is it shows you this is 150 years ago.
Yeah.
People were thinking about this. So there have been these parallel tracks for a long time with different notions about how we could or should do things. But we haven't really chose to take those tracks yet.
No. And so a lot of what we do in ecological economics is also to talk about where does the narrative come from, who does it benefit, who does it harm, how do those in power perpetuate narratives that don't help those not in power. So that's also the social justice piece of the work that we do in ecological economics more broadly. My most recent book is called The Progress Illusion, with the subtitle Reclaiming Our Future from the Fairy Tale of Economics. So really kind of beat up on my own field of economics to say that it is not the field, it's not the narrative, it's not, especially not the master narrative that we need right now. And in most policy circles, it's white male economists like this, like here, that are controlling the narrative. And that's a big, big problem. So, much of what we do is try to change that.
I was wondering, since we, was it the cost, like, when we shifted the language from like only economy to like economy for well-being, was that the Constitution? Like, what document was that in? Sorry. You were mentioning,
Sure.
well, you said something
The
about.
Vermont law you're talking about?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, about 12 years ago, we passed a law that's changing the Progress Indicator Act.
Oh, okay, cool.
But it was like one of these classic study bills. It's like, yeah, we know there's a problem, go study it.
Right,
Now we're trying to get to the more of the implementation side.
okay. So has there been like any, like, since that, has there been any shifts in like kind of the way we do things at all, or like?
There has, I mean, that bill and that work is intersected with a lot of the work we're doing on farm to plate in Vermont. A lot of work that we're doing on organic agriculture and soils. A lot of work that is talking the language of a restorative economy, not just a growth economy, not a green growth economy, but like what would a restorative economy look like? And how do we sort of take justice and put it front, forward,
Yeah.
instead of saying, first we grow the economy, then justice will take care of itself. First we grow the economy, then the environment will take care of itself. So a lot of ecological economics is a real simple reprioritization. To say that if you deplete your environment, nothing else matters. If we don't equally share in the benefits and burdens of our economy, nothing else matters. Then we can get to things like technology and efficiency and all that great stuff that a place like UVM spends most of its time doing. Make that a third-tier goal instead of a first-tier goal. Yeah. Like you want efficiency, you want your economy, you want your state university to serve higher purpose. So that's a lot of this reprioritization. Not sure who. Ursula, go ahead.
So it sounds that the planetary health approach is working more with the academia and the Vermont Prosperity Project more with NGOs and
I just saw myself.
yeah.
It's a picture from like 15 years ago. Yeah.
And I am just wondering how we can transition to the grassroots and the public and the people and in a participatory way and not by regional organizations scale.
I do think it's about the study of social movements, movement building. I think Stephen mentioned the degrowth. Degrowth is kind of the movement behind ecological economics, and it's really happening at the grassroots level. We're working with a group called the Next Systems Project that is actually studying the next system by saying this is happening in communities and neighborhoods. It's just, it hasn't been, it's not like mainstream media doesn't shine a light on it. And there are things out there that are trying alternative currencies and alternative relationships and the gift economy and the well-being economy and different kinds of exchange economies. And we see these things bubble up in reaction to crisis, like COVID. We saw communities that had really good alternative economies in place, weathered the storm. Those that were very dependent on the market economy didn't do so well. So these things exist, like in a sustainable future, they're just in pockets. So some of what academics can do is like really study social movement and from where the new ideas come from, and to realize that more often than not, new ideas come in and move the mainstream out of crisis. So a lot of like getting back within the scale of what the planet can sustain, I kind of frame it as we're going to have to either do this by disaster or by design. I'd like to think that universities are a space where we can think about doing it by design. The reality is lots of times we're doing this out of necessity, out of disaster, but same thing, we better have the good ideas laying around for when the next hurricane hits Central Florida, and when people stop realizing that this isn't like once in a million years. I'm like, no, it's just like, this is the future that we now have created for ourselves. Someone else had a, yes?
So this might be a broad question, and I apologize for that. I've been kind of thinking on the graph you showed early on showing the progress in different countries relative to all these biological boundaries that have been transgressed. I was kind of wondering on kind of that broader scale, since it sounds like in like a Vermont case, you do look at this kind of in a grassroots way with all of these just like group work that you've been doing, but like on that big scale, we're looking at these social goals in terms of like a country level or an international level in the UN case, how do you kind of meaningfully get to that and measure it? Because like I remember you pointed out the US was pretty high up there, and I think about a lot of the stuff that we try and do here, where we're talking about the problems that are still happening here in our country, and if we're ranking high there, how are we measuring what that progress actually is and what's a meaningful boundary, I guess? I'm sorry, that's rambling.
No, it's okay, but a graph like that hides a lot of the challenges in countries like our own, because it's a graph based on averages, right? It's a graph based on target for a whole population. But actually, if you take something like, so a lot of work's been done of taking the Sustainable Development Goals and indexing them. And then within that index, actually pulling out the most vulnerable groups within society and showing, so if you just look at the index, you're like, hey, we're doing pretty good. And then you pull out the vulnerable groups within a society and you go, uh-oh, we got big problems here. So those kinds of graphs hide the distributional nature of meeting those goals. And then you sort of realize that, yeah, as a country, we're doing good on poverty. And then you say, well, wait a minute, we have the highest poverty rate of all industrialized countries right now. So like, what's our peers? What's our metrics? What is the good life? So this kind of work of sort of redefining what is the good life for all, but within the means of the planet, to me, that's like the challenge of our generation, right? I could take your question in so many ways, but maybe
No, that's
happy to talk later.
that's really insightful.
I think we got to wrap,
Okay,
right?
considering the time
Yes.
constraint, we'll go for one final
Okay,
question.
one final question. Yes.
Okay, so something that I think a lot about is how like military plays such a massive role in both economy and climate.
Yeah.
And I'm just like wondering kind of what the discourse is around that and changing our, business as usual with that, because I feel like that's, part of the peace and justice part of the pie, like indefinitely, and it's something that has to shift if we want to
Yeah, big
envision
time.
any kind of sustainable future.
Well, I could take that in a lot of ways too. I study this phenomena of the rise and fall of societies too. All systems, this is something it's hard to come to terms with, all systems fail. All systems decline. And then new systems arise, right? So right now you're seeing a militarized system that has to do that to hang on to the current system. So that's one way to take the question. Just in the language of GDP, gross domestic product, to get to a net GDP, net of benefits and costs, are our military expenditures a regrettable expense? I think a lot of citizens would say yes. So we shouldn't count that as contributing to our well-being. So we subtract military expenditures right off the top in any kind of index of national well-being. And that makes a huge difference. And then the third piece is I'll say, I worked a bunch with Senator Sanders and his staff on his Green New Deal. And the way that he pulled off 17 point something trillion over 10 years was take military spending, shrink it, and take that money and bring it over here. So a lot of people say, well, this 10-year agenda is inflationary, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, it's actually still the same level of spending, but it's a reprioritization of spending. So that's this kind of genuine progress work, is reprioritization of spending. And that's where we've made some impact in the State House in Vermont. Just to shift from the quantity of the economy to the quality of the economy was a big step. So I think the military thing fits in there.
I'm sorry that we would go for many questions and a longer discussion. That would be wonderful, but due to time constraint, we are stopping
Yes.
there. And it is very impactful, John's talk, and it is related with our previous class that we talk about the local to the global impact and the global thinker. So it's really enlightening us and is providing some clues to think from local to the international level for impactful work with the planetary health initiative. And John referred a book, Disaster by Design, that was written by Dennis Gillespie, one prof, and it was based on the disaster, basically the London disaster. So thank you so much, John, for your time.
Thank you. I wish I could stay.
Okay, feel free to use washroom or if you need some break to go outside, because we have 4 speakers, 1 left, so we have 3 more coming. Okay. Now it's my honor again to introduce Dr. Nicholas Afflito. All right. transition, sorry. He's a new professor at the Rubinstein School, and Professor Nick obtained his BS and MS degrees from the Northern Arizona University, and he obtained his doctoral study degree from Cornell University. His major research focused on entomology, forest health, semiochemicals, applied sensory ecology, machine learning, and remote sensing. So we're welcoming Dr. Nicholas Afflitu to our class. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, it's great to meet all of you. Thanks for the introduction. John is a tough act to follow. So I'm certainly earlier in my career than John is, and I think this talk is not as far-reaching and as expansive of a perspective, I would say. Just sort of giving a little flavor for the research I do and trying to link that to the purview of this class. Yeah, so the title of the talk, The Language of the Land, Learning How Organisms Perceive Their Environment to Meet Our Environmental Goals. And this involves my interest in sensory ecology, and we'll get into a little bit of that in the coming slides. And should I advance from over here? Or? Oh, okay. So as Lee mentioned, I'm brand new here, just started in August, so like a month and a half in. So I appreciate the opportunity to get to meet some more of you in the school and more broadly. My background's kind of split, so I kind of have a traditional academic background that kind of brought me to this position, but I also have a whole other side of me that is from the private industry. And so I'm really excited to kind of bring those together for the benefit of our students here, both like on the research side, but professional development as well. And so the majority of my research involves plant-insect interactions, and less so on the social side, kind of calling out John's much more expansive talk. But so I'm really interested in how organisms interpret, perceive, and behaviorally change in the presence of environmental cues. And so I want to use this knowledge to try to find new ways to meet our environmental and management goals. So really my passion for doing research and the career that I've chosen was to solve real world problems. Like that's what gets me excited. I love basic research, I value it, use it every day, but my interest is in applying and using and seeing real world outcomes from my research. I'm often really looking for the lightest touch possible when working on a problem. So rather than blasting something with a broad spectrum insecticide, like let's be very targeted and find ways to meet those goals without causing much wider effects. And yeah, and largely a lot of my work is driven by trying to help undo or mitigate some of the human-induced damage that we've caused to our environment. So as the new forest ecosystem health professor, my top priority is really creating a space for students to explore and find their passions in the forest health realm, which is quite a large catch-all. I had the same opportunity afforded to me in a forest health lab when I was getting started out in this career, and it really changed my trajectory. So I really think it's very important to allow students to explore areas that they are most excited about and not necessarily where my expertise applies. And then also being at a land-grant institution, I think it's really important and incumbent on me to try to meet the emerging forest health needs of the state of Vermont and the region. I think that's really important, and I think that's something I always think about working towards. So my areas of research are applied sensory ecology and forest entomology and forest health. And mirroring that, in spring I'll be teaching 2 classes, forest ecosystem health, and a new class, applied sensory ecology. So I'll talk a little bit about at the end. So what is sensory ecology? So we all know about our primary senses, and insects and plants also have very highly tuned sensory systems, which isn't a surprise to most of us in this room, I'm sure. What it is a little bit of a different perspective is thinking not from our own view of the world. We're a very visually oriented species, and we can often impose this view on other organisms in the environment without actually trying to understand how they're perceiving their own environment. So for insects, smell is the dominant modality, the way they perceive their environment, interpret their environment. And that's very different than humans, and it's hard for us to grasp. It's also really hard to quantify sound and vision. It's much easier to quantify. So it just kind of gets forgotten often. but it's a really powerful tool to work with organisms as far as insects to try to alter their behavior in different ways, and things like that. So plants also are amazing and have really tuned sensory systems. Many probably are surprised by, as a kid playing with like a mimosa plant or Venus flytrap and watching it move to touch. But plants also smell and hear. And plants, primarily, I would say, a dominant way they perceive their environment is also through olfaction or smell. And this is really interesting. I use this analogy. You might have heard a talk I've given before, so forgive the repeat. But if you smell, when you're walking in summer in Vermont and smelling cut grass, that really characteristic smell, those are green leaf volatiles that those grass blades are emitting after they're damaged by the lawnmower. And those are floating in the air for other green plants to receive that cue. And they will pick that information up and respond to it, denoting that there's an attack nearby. They would probably think that's an herbivore, not a lawnmower. And they can induce secondary metabolites in their leaf tissue to make it less palatable or toxic, things like that. So it's really interesting to think about all these cues floating around the environment. There's cues crossing from different plant species to others, and there's a whole lot going on that we just can't see. And the hope is that we can uncover some of that through sensory ecology. So how do we apply sensory ecology? So from a basic science perspective, it's very fascinating to learn about species interactions, but what can we do with it? So some of the things, we can better monitor plant and insect or animal populations. So we might want to look for a certain species that's arriving that might be invasive, and we want to try to detect it as quickly as possible. We can mitigate these outbreaks that happen by trapping out certain insects by having really highly tuned cues that bring them to traps, or we can confuse them, or we can disrupt their mating, and so the population will collapse. Without the use of something like an insecticide that really blankets over and kills like all arthropods. We can improve plant resilience, which is interesting. I mentioned that green leaf volatiles are floating out there. Plants receive them and then can become more defended after they detected that cue. And I've done some work in this area, and others have done much more, where you can prime plants with these compounds artificially, and then they're more defended from herbivore attacks or pathogens. Conservation also is another interesting area for this application. We might be able to attract pollinators to areas where we want them to pollinate, or repel them from areas that are going to have like some sort of treatment applied or something like that. So we can work with pollination and improve that. My broad areas of research in sensory ecology are in chemical communication through semiochemicals. And semiochemicals are just message-carrying compounds. Semio is the Greek word for signal. So it's basically a smell. And so volatile chemicals. And then acoustic via sound and vibrations. Okay, so I was thinking about tying my work to promoting sustainability, and I just brought up a few projects that I've worked on that kind of relate to this area. So in the private industry, I've worked on building forecasting tools for wildfires. This is kind of a different side of my life. As I said, I have the whole other private industry side. And a lot of this work was used to help and is being used to help communities affected in the wild-urban land interface. Also, new ways to mitigate the impact of wildfire. So figuring out virtually how can we change the environment around communities to improve their resilience to wildfire. And then I've worked with cooperative extension throughout the United States in three different states, working to translate scientific knowledge for the public, but then also learning from the public what we should be researching. I think cooperative extension is a really amazing system throughout the United States that's able to it's a conduit between researchers and the communities that need it. And I think it's really important. And then so on the plant protection side, I think this is where a majority of my work has been, as I've suggested. So developing numerous lures and semiochemical treatments for bark beetle species, and native and invasive insects, and acoustic treatments. Did some work repelling beetles from trees using sounds of their predators and sounds of stress calls that they release, things like that. And then on the crop side, I've done equally number of projects on for row crops and for berry crops as well, like developing repellents and such. And today I want to talk just a little bit about some of my dissertation work, which was in a row crop. So I was really excited about working in a system that had an important problem to tackle, and potatoes, which I love potatoes just to begin with, but they are an amazing crop. They are a really important piece of the puzzle for food security in the world. So 2/3 of the world's population consume potatoes as a staple food, and it's the third most important food crop globally. And what's really neat about them is that they produce more calories on less land, with less water, and faster than any other major food crop. So there's a lot of reasons to support potato growth for global food security reasons. And since, you know, kind of drop the tater tots. Forgot about that. So yeah, other animals like potatoes too. They're tasty. So Colorado potato beetle is the most damaging herbivore pest of potatoes globally. They're everywhere potatoes are. And as you can see by one of my field site photos, they will chew the plants down to the ground. They'll eat the stems and will reduce yield to 0 if it's left unattended. And what's interesting about Colorado potato beetle is they have a propensity to develop insecticide resistance faster than many other insects. And this is just a list from the 80s up here of some of the really common insecticides that they've already developed resistance to. This list is much longer now, and it's kind of a scary problem because we don't have great tools to deal with this insect chemical tools. So I thought this is a neat challenge. Like maybe I could put my sensory ecology hat and try to tackle some and try to help here a little. So up here on top is the Colorado potato beetle larvae, and then the spine soldier bug is eating the larvae here. And so I came into the lab, and there was some previous work showing that the Colorado potato beetle changed its behavior when it was in the presence of this stink bug, and it fed a little less on plants when it was near the stink bug. And given its name, stink bug, lots of chemicals coming out of this animal. And so I was excited about this project. So, and as all of you know, I'm distilling 4.5 years of research into a couple slides here. So I think there's some things just kind of we'll quickly go through. But the process I went through is first I wanted to ID the compounds that were present in this system, particularly the compounds coming out of this spine soldier bug. And then once we figured out what those compounds were, make a synthetic blend of this predator, and then run lab trials and field trials to see if we can reduce the damage by just synthetically introducing these compounds into the environment. And really the ultimate goal was to exploit predator cues for a biocompatible treatment. So for objective 1, I zeroed into this large exocrine gland in the spine soldier bug. It takes up the majority of their abdomen. It's quite huge. And it contained many different compounds, but primarily 10 chemical compounds in that gland that they released. So this is really cool, kind of know now what we're working with. Then we can synthetically make that same blend. I used the top 5 compounds in that blend and made these really simple open dispersion Eppendorf tube dispensers with some holes on top, and the odors just naturally evaporate out of there in the field and provided stink bug smelling treatment. So on this top panel, we wanted to run some trials using the live predators in the field as well. So we have these breathable bags meant to restrict all the other sensory cues, or try to, and let the odors emanate out of them of the stink bugs. So we had 10 live stink bugs in here. This was a beast to maintain. Every couple days you have to go to hundreds of sites and count all the stink bugs. They're also cannibalistic, so they're eating each other in there, so you have to keep replacing them, and it was kind of a nightmare. And then we also in this latter parts of my research and my dissertation, we started running these field trials with the synthetic dispenser, it just sitting in the plot center. Okay, so nothing really exciting here. This is with the live predators, the challenging treatment to maintain. So we just have the presence or absence of plant damage, Day 1, day 3, day 5, and this is the second year here. And then the blue bars are the treatment, and the gray bars are the control. No effect over the season. We did see some of the effect in the lab. This was really disappointing, but it's just a testament to how things often will fail when you bring them out of the lab into the field. There's so many different variables. So, okay, nothing here. Then for the synthetic predator treatment, we did start to see a signal. So this is again the same sort of graph, probability of finding damage, either trending or significant. And over the whole season, the presence of damage on the plants that contained the synthetic odors was statistically lower. And then on the top panel here, this is also the presence absence of adults, eggs, and larvae. So great, like we're starting to see something here. Like there's fewer adults, there's fewer eggs, there's fewer larvae. And then we look at the absolute numbers here. The average number of larvae, there were 31% less larvae on those plots and 46% less plant damage. So cool, there's something there. And really where the rubber meets the road when you're working, especially with a food crop, is what happens to the yield. So it's great. Plants, they ate less, they were less likely to be found in the plant. Doesn't really mean much if the yield is not affected. And in the end, we were able to show like a 14% bump in yield in those plots that contained this stink bug odor. So this is a paper that's coming out soon, I'm excited about. And then really the cherry on top for me to get my work out in the field was working to get it approved for organic use in 2020. So it was certified, and now in the Northeast, farmers can legally use these compounds to help protect their plants. You know, doesn't solve the problem, just helps the problem, and still be organic certified. Okay, so I just kind of ran through that project. I want to kind of leave us with this plug for the class I'm teaching next spring, if anybody's interested. So it's going to be cross-listed between FOR and SCP, Applied Sensory Ecology. And it's going to be a really fun class. We're going to explore the different mechanisms that plants and insects use to perceive and respond to their environment. And we're going to examine how we can use this information to meet management goals. And I put this really catchy, is this playing though? Yeah, okay, cool. So remember I mentioned the green leaf volatiles, the smell of the grass? Well, this is how a plant is receiving that cue and sending that signal and having a systemic response to those compounds. So you can see that the smell is then being transmitted through the plant tissue for them to then mount this systemic response to an impending attack. Pretty fascinating, I think at least. But yeah, please reach out if you have any other questions, or I think we have some time now to talk more about any of this, but thank you.
Questions and comments?
Yeah?
So if I mow my lawn next to my vegetable garden, are my vegetables going to taste worse?
No, probably not, but they might be slightly more defended from herbivores.
Yeah.
It's not a like one-to-one thing. Certain suites of compounds, they're general and some are more specific, so it's not as cut and dry as that, but yeah, potentially they could be more defended.
Yeah.
I don't think they would taste worse. I mean, but that's an interesting question. If you're eating the leaf tissue, so if it's like lettuce, it could probably have an effect on the flavor. That's a good question. I don't know that, but you are inducing a systemic response in the leaf tissue that are defensive compounds that may or may not taste good to you. Yeah.
It sounds logical.
What's that?
I mean, if the plant is responding defensively, what's it going to do? Produce chemicals that don't taste good?
Well, it don't taste good to an insect.
To a predator of some kind.
Yeah, or an herbivore. Yeah. So, but we have very different things. What we think is tasting good is very different than an insect. Yeah.
I'm really interested to hear about your work in like making lures to like drawing insects.
Yeah.
Like, how is that applied like to invasive species?
Totally. I didn't have enough time to talk about some of the other projects I did in that area. But one example was when I worked in Washington State for their cooperative extension there, and I was in the Columbia River Gorge, and there's a new bark beetle species that was moving northward because of the warming climate, and it kind of, at that point, crossed the threshold across the Columbia River Gorge into Washington. It was causing a bunch of pine tree mortality in that area. And there wasn't a great way to monitor for it because the lures were not very good that existed, and they were really expensive. So I worked with a semiochemical company, and we developed this new lure that was much more effective. And in our research and studying this lure, we had trap roots along the kind of front of the insects moving, and we actually knocked down the outbreak because we trapped so many, and we trapped like 100,000 beetles. So it's just a testament to like when you find the right cues that an insect or an organism is looking for, it can be really powerful and really targeted. You know, the bark beetles are the size of like a grain of rice, and so when you're working out in a huge forest, like it's a challenge of scale. Like how are you going to find this organism? How are you going to like work with it? But it's through chemicals that float in the air, and they can detect these from very far away. And so that's one example. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's like really cool.
Oh, thanks.
I feel like that's like, I don't know, like how bad like all these invasive bugs are getting. It's like, are you gonna do scramble? So like,
It's like, yeah.
That sounds like a really like cool.
And something I'm like, my lab is working on now, like getting started, is a new pipeline to develop semiochemicals faster. Like I showed this process for like, my dissertation that took years to go through, and like we don't have years when an invasive species arrives at like our shipping yard in Burlington. Like we need to like develop something quickly. So finding new ways to do that is kind of the challenge. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's super cool presentation. It's awesome. So, do you see a lot of buy-in from farmers for like the pheromone stuff
Yeah.
organic stuff, or are people like not buying?
It depends. It's a good question because if you're an organic farmer, grower, they're much more receptive to these like more alternative treatments.
Yeah.
Working with farmers that are on like a spray cycle and they're like, no, if we spray on Tuesdays, we don't care. Like they don't want to bother with it. They look at it as like more of a nuisance because, and I mean, from their perspective, I see they're just like on their track. They know how much, how many gallons of insecticides they're going to need that season. It's all like budgeted out. They don't want to mess with that. And farmers are busy and like whatever. But an organic grower who often has limited options to deal with in some of the pests, they're much more keen and interested in it. And that's kind of why I took the organic certification route for it. That's where I was seeing more interest from growers because they're just more receptive to these types of new treatments.
That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
I worked in plant healthcare and was a pesticide applicator for many years.
Yeah.
And over the course of the time I worked there, I very much found that. We used a lot of permethrin, which
Yes.
is always on your list.
Yeah, that's
It was not working.
Yeah.
And we used permethrin for things like hip spark beetle and Japanese beetle.
Yeah.
And it became less and less effective. So we'd have to use like slightly greater concentrations.
Yep.
And then we eventually got to the point where we were like, okay, well, we're burning leaves. Like,
Yeah.
where's the, like, there's no middle
This is
ground
not
to walk in. So, like,
Yeah.
either you kill none of them or you hurt the tree. And what I was wondering is if, like, we started experimenting like a very little bit with, like, praying mantis and ladybug eggs, like eat aphids and stuff like
Yep.
that, just for like a smaller scale control.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about the like economic feasibility of these pheromone traps. That's really interesting.
Yeah, thanks for your question. And actually, the project I mentioned in Washington was an IPS, Carpophysis was an IPS beetle.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
invading.
yeah.
So the economics can be challenging because, farmers they don't have a lot of room for mistakes, right? So they often don't want to adopt these new technologies and test them out. I'm sorry, what was your?
Oh, I was just wondering about the economic feasibility of like pheromone traps.
So like, what I thought was interesting was like, so we started bringing these live ones out into the field, the live predators as a treatment, and like that's so infeasible. And then like a lot of biocontrols are also really economically feasible because like mortality and like they often leave the site. Like how do you retain them? There's a lot of challenges there. So like for controlled agriculture and things like that, those type of biocontrols can be super effective, right? So you're in a greenhouse, you're in a grow room. They can really have a big effect. Out in the field, it's challenging. And so that's what's kind of cool about using like a semiochemical. And some compounds are expensive to purchase and synthesize. Fortunately, none of those that were in the blend that I just showed you were very expensive. So economically, it was a viable option from that regard. And definitely worth the 14% increase in yield.
Great.
So that's always the balance. It's challenging for that reason.
Yeah, I was curious about that because we also experimented with like live predators on site.
Yeah.
But then we had a similar issue because we did praying mantises.
Yeah.
And A, they were struggling to find their like prey, and B, we had the same issue where we're like, oh, they're eating each other. Like,
Yeah.
the females are eating the males, and the population's not getting
It's
bigger.
difficult. Another cool way to kind of like a middle road is bringing like, same using semiochemicals, using attractants for the predators. So like bring them to your field sites, like as a flag, like signal, hey, like come over here, like we have some pests for you to eat. And that can also work too, so you can get like the natural immigration from populations in the field margins to come into your field a bit more, things like that.
Yeah, this is awesome.
Thanks.
I'll be see me in this class, honestly.
All right, cool. I hope so. Any more questions? Or?
Okay, one final question.
Can I ask a quick question?
Oh, okay, one online, so. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Yeah.
Just a quick question, kind of twofold. One, have you ever looked at sort of like side-by-side planting effectiveness in pest repellent and that sort of thing? Like if you plant something next to potatoes, could that repel the plants? And then two, since you've done all this research and know so much about these bugs and these plants, do you have a very successful garden at home for the pests?
Oh, I wish that was the case. Like before I got back into academia, I built furniture, and it's like the joke, like the person that builds furniture always has the worst furniture in their house. Like you never keep anything for yourself. It's kind of true for that. Like I try to do my best in the garden, but I'm not like I don't have like a magic green thumb or anything like that. But your first question is really a good one. Like companion planting is really important, from my perspective, from a sensory perspective, you can plant certain plants that provide these cues in the environment that can help with your goals. So there's some cool examples, and even genetically modified examples in rice, where they can produce compounds that repel aphids and things like that. So there's some cool opportunities there. Also, yeah, using it in the GMO world, but also just companion planting can be really beneficial. So it's a good one.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
The final question from the please.
I've got a bunch of questions, but I wanted to make a quick comment about farmers' willingness to adopt these different practices, especially on the more conventional side, but sometimes it's a matter of getting to their crop consultant, right? Because they're employing those folks, and it's like having them be convinced that it's going to work and then be willing to change their buying practices. Like so much of this is like really like the farmer's relationship with like their seed or their spray person, and then their relationships with the companies that they have, and breaking up essentially like that community.
That's true. Yeah, the crop consultants often are the key, especially to large growers. Like getting in with them and introducing this and showing them this work, I think can help. I do think the economics of it are difficult for large growers too, just because they have so much to think about, and this is more of a nuanced approach that they might not have the time to deal with. And I think so smaller organic growers typically are adopting this technology more readily. I don't know if you have a different experience, but you're right, crop consultants are key for getting into large.
And my other question is, do you have any concerns, like obviously like, this is a safer approach than spraying chemicals, but do you have any concerns about these applications negatively impacting non-target species?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it needs more research. So a lot of these compounds are like all of these compounds are also found in plants. So we're not introducing some very bizarre like Frankenstein compound that we've created in the lab out there. So these are like linalool is something that's in all of our shampoo often, like things like that, or like alpha terpenes and things like that that we might be eating as food flavors and things. So there's less of a, like we're not putting anything toxic overtly, but it is something to consider. Like you are altering the sensory scape of that area in some way. We're always going to have an effect, I think, on the environment when we're doing anything like growing food and things like that. So there's going to be like non-target effects always, but like what's the lightest way we can have like lightest impact, I guess. Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Well, we love to continue our conversation, but unfortunately, same thing, due to time limitation. Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Nick, for coming and our health to specific forestry and ecology. But I see it's beyond that, agriculture too. We love to eat potatoes. So we saw some insight from the potatoes. So thank you so much, Dr. Nick. Now welcome to Dr. Rachel Gold, our another speaker. And Dr. Rachel Gold is an assistant professor at the Rubinstein School and renowned Gant Fellow. She is contributing a lot to the Gandhi Institute and the overall at the University of Vermont beyond the scale. She obtained her BA degree from the Harvard University and MA from the Yale and a doctoral degree from the Stanford University. Her research focused on environmental values, well-being, cultural ecosystem services, environmental learning, human behavior, policy, diversity, and equity. She is contributing a lot in this field. So it's warm welcome to Dr. Rachel Gold. Over to you.
First of all, I don't need to be looking at that. The second, I would love to draw something. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. It's just old style. But I would first love to know just a little bit about who's in the room. So you may have already done this 100 times, so sorry. But curious, I'm going to ask about disciplinary focus. So social, natural, or very combined. Those are your three options. So social scientists, if you're working mostly on social science. I see show of hands. Okay. Mostly on natural science. Okay, and it's very combined, like you couldn't choose between the two. Okay, awesome. That's really helpful. And what are your levels? So how many of you are undergrads?
No, all
Nobody,
grads.
all grads. Okay, masters? Okay, and PhD? Okay, great. Wonderful. And then, are you all in Rubenstein, or are they different schools?
No, two from CDA.
CDA. Okay, great. Great. Okay, well, I really want to have time for discussion. So I know we're starting a little late, and someone else is coming at 11:30. So I will do an abbreviated little version of what I was going to talk about and leave plenty of time for discussion. I think that's the most fun. So as you saw in my little bio, and as Celine introduced, I have two main research areas, and those are the areas that I research and then think about connections to policy. So the first, I'm going to sort of update what was in that bio. So non-material values is my first area of research. I'll say more about that. The second one is environmental learning and behavior. And what's happened lately in my work is that I'm looking at really the intersection of these two. There's a lot of interesting overlap between these two. Okay, so starting with non-material values, my work here started with work on cultural ecosystem services. And how many of you are familiar with that concept, cultural ecosystem services? Okay, so
Concept?
cultural ecosystem services. I'll write it down. So this is the version, so this was like maybe 3/4 of you, but ecosystem. So ecosystem services is this idea that has gotten a lot of play that we need nature for lots of reasons. For physical reasons is what we often talk about. So we get physical things, provisioning services they're called, this is the food and fiber that we need. A lot of attention to regulating ecosystem services, which are things like mangroves that mitigate, that do storm attenuation, or wetlands that purify water. Those are regulating services. And then there's this other category of services that are called cultural in the initial portrayal of this. And those are the non-material ones. So we sort of decided that non-material is a better name for that because they address all of the kinds of services that aren't necessarily physical, that aren't purely physical, I should say. So this is things like, the things I study are spirituality, identity, heritage, the psychological benefits of nature, that kind of thing. So that's where this work is. That's this area. And it's moved into including now, this field has really moved to dealing a lot with something called relational values. This is an idea that values, these kinds of values, the non-material values of nature, are really connected to the relationships that we have with nature. And I can say more about, obviously, any of this if you want me to. So this is area number one, and this is really my main area of research, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that one, and then I'll give you one example of what I'm doing in each of these. And one of our guiding questions was, how does this relate to the Rubenstein's mission and mission question, which I really appreciate. And so I'll talk about in those examples how I think about the mission question. So the learning and behavior bit is environmental education related. So I teach environmental education, and a number of my projects, some of my students work on environmental learning as well. And then environmental learning is really connected to behavior. So most of the definitions of environmental education include essentially active citizenship, which is a form of behavior. So sort of form of, we learn about these things and what do we do with the information that we learn about the environment. And so in this area, I've looked at the way that acquiring information, how that changes how we think about how we're acting related to the environment. And then my work here a lot now is about the intersection, how values relate to learning and behavior. So there's a surprisingly small amount of work on how values relate to behavior. There's a lot of attention to the fact that there are often disconnects between what we value and what we do. And so a lot of this work is looking at, okay, how can we create more tight links between information, learning things, connecting that to what we value, and then connecting that to what we do. Okay, so the example I'll give with non-material values is that one of the things that, one of the ways that I'm working towards answering the mission question of, I won't get it exactly, but how can we sort of work towards transformative change and unleash empathy, innovation, creativity, and passion. I think those are the 4 words. And those are 4 good words. So 2 that I really try to focus on in the academic part of this work are the creativity and innovation pieces. So one of the paper that I shared with you, did anybody look at that? Okay, so that creativity piece is related to this, so the multiple values of nature. It's looking at this idea that we should be able to express why nature matters in more ways than just using dollar value. So in the early phases of ecosystem services work, they were often monetized, saying we're going to use dollar values to express how much ecosystem services are worth. And this new strand of work, very large international strand of work, is saying that's not adequate, that doesn't always capture why ecosystems matter, particularly the non-material way. So monetary value is particularly bad at representing, for instance, sacredness, or the identity, or heritage, or psychological aspects of nature, the ways that nature benefits us, or the kind of relationships we have. And so that's what that paper is about, is I think that there's a whole world out there of possibilities of ways we could talk about and represent how nature matters in a decision-making context. So I'm particularly focused on, great, a lot of people know this. Social scientists have been talking about this for decades. What we really need to do is try to get it into a context where people are making decisions so that it's more integrated into the way that things play out in the world. So that's where I try to really push that innovation and creativity point. That's what that article was about. Like, can we think differently about what it means to represent, to bring information into the decision-making sphere, to sort of expand the boundaries of what we think of as science, to expand the boundaries of what we think of as appropriate information to enter into our decision-making context. So that's something I'm working on here. So one example, I have a couple of projects I'm really excited about that are, after I've been doing this for a decade or 15 years, I'm finally getting to the point of some very specific projects applying this work in governance context. So one I'll mention is NOAA, which is National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, that NOAA. They do a coral reef valuation every decade or so. The NOAA as an organization says, hey, we want to look at why coral reefs matter for this country. And it's very interesting to mention this project that a lot of our coral reefs are in protectorates, they're almost all in colonized areas, because the ones in Florida are in really bad shape. So anyway, we can talk about any of these details if you want, but it's what they've done in the past, their past valuations, is they go and they do an economic valuation. So they use all these traditional economic techniques to say these are ecosystem services that corals provide to the country. We get these big billion-dollar numbers. Well, this time when they started doing that, people in the jurisdiction said, no, this is not okay. Just giving a dollar value is really not enough. That's really not representing the full picture of why coral reefs matter. We really need to do something else. And so they brought me on as a consultant to help to bring what we've been working on in academia for a while into the policy sphere. And so we're doing this, we're in the middle of it, and we're working, they're doing the economic valuation, and I'm working very closely with that team. Like, how can we then add non-monetary valuation of some of these spiritual, cultural, identity-related elements of corals into the picture and present them alongside each other? And it's very challenging, but very exciting, because it's really where the best values assessment, so if you're into this is another thing that was a really big part of my life a couple of years ago. So IPBES, anyone know what this stands for? Yeah.
Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services.
Perfect, yes. Well done. I can't even remember that sometimes, so that was really impressive. Okay, so IPBES, which is this, it's basically the IPCC, but for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So it brings together expert academics from all over the world to summarize what we know about valuation for policymakers. One of the big things this asks for, basically the main point of it, is we need to be doing plural valuation. So multiple kinds of valuation. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking and let you ask questions. I will say just 1 minute or less about the project I'm going to mention here, which is my colleague in CDAE, Tricia Shrum, and I recently got a Catalyst Award from the Gund Institute, and we're starting, our postdoc arrives in a day, and we're calling it the Behavior First Project. And this project, we're super excited about. There's some inklings from multiple different social sciences, particularly the non-positivistic ones, that instead of having this model of values lead to behavior, this is what most people think, most people talk about. I even talked about it this way a few minutes ago. This is sort of the dominant model. Well, there's some evidence that actually the way we work as humans is our behavior influences our values, and that if we do certain things, there's all these psychological processes. Once we do something, we're like, oh, that's me. I'm the kind of person who does that thing. That must mean I think certain things are important. For instance, I'm the kind of person who goes out of my way to not drive and take public transportation. That must mean I'm the kind of person who cares about reducing carbon. That must mean I have some environmental values. So we're calling it the Starting with Behavior First Project. And so we're going to ask people experimentally to engage in environmentally sort of labeled actions and then see if that changes their identity and values. So see if there's that link going the other direction instead of this way. Like, is this wrong? Okay, I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions, so I will stop. And I would love to hear whatever questions you have, thoughts, comments, etc. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the last thing that you were just talking about. What comes up for me is what happens when I'm learning about something that's going on in the world and it affects my values. So I hear about manufacturers dumping chemicals and thinking, the value that emerges for me is people should clean up after themselves. So then I go out into the world and I start cleaning up after myself.
Okay.
So there's the vicarious.
Yeah. I mean, really interesting. So that's like, it's learning about someone else's actions and then basically saying, that's showing me I don't want to be like that.
That was that case, yeah.
Yeah, that was that case. I mean, this is what's so interesting, the relationships between our learning and our values and our behavior are really complex, and that's sort of why we're looking into studying those things. I mean, I think in that case, that's a version of, the thing that makes me think of a little bit is Paulo Freire. Is anyone familiar with Paulo Freire? So big theorist in education and sort of anti-colonial methods. He's a Brazilian, brilliant thinker, philosopher. He has this concept that I can't pronounce because I don't speak Portuguese, but it's conscientizao, basically conscientization, becoming conscious. And that's his big sort of call for education, is that what we should be doing is creating consciousness, that's awareness of the world around, like wider awareness of what's around us. And I think that's a big thing that environmental education can do. And so that's a form of, you've learned about what's this situation. Once you know about that situation, it changes the way you think. It points out like, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous way of being in the world. And once you have that consciousness, it's really hard. It can be. If you're fully conscious, it can be hard to go back and do the same things that you were doing before because you have this new awareness. So that's an element of the learning stuff that I work on that I really like thinking about. It's sort of it's a lot about mindfulness and fully looking at the world. And I think if you really do that, you start to see some things as
So my example complexifies your model, but I think it still places behavior first. It's just that I've had a vicarious experience of behavior that affected my values. So somebody else's behavior.
Someone else's behavior, yeah, so that's not what we're talking about, if you're watching
No, it
someone else's
isn't.
behavior.
No, it isn't. Yeah, I'm just saying it complexifies
Yeah.
your model.
Right, it
because
adds, like,
It incorporates a third
someone
party.
else's,
or a
yeah.
second party.
It's like your behavior and then someone else's behavior, others' behavior. Sorry for this writing. Cool, okay, yeah.
I see some parallels between what you're working on or trying to work on in behavioral economics.
Okay, oh yeah.
In behavioral economics, there's a lot of like, look at what you're doing to find out what you actually value.
Yeah.
So you're trying to
Yeah.
like adjust like how you're spending your money, or how you want to make your money, or how you want to do that, rather than saying, oh, these are my values, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Actually look at yourself and see what you actually really do, and that'll help you understand like where you're coming from. Because most of us are kind of living in some illusions about who we are and what we are and what we're trying to accomplish.
That's very deep and very, very true. So are you thinking of applying behavioral economics like sort of individually then, or in a research context? Because the way you just said it, I sort of interpret it individually, but.
I'm just, in general, I've thought about behavioral economics for quite a while. Some of it's kind of worked its way into pop literature around how to kind of moderate your own behavior in order to align yourself with your values economically, because we express a lot of our values economically. You know,
Yeah.
we go,
Yeah.
pretty much
Yeah.
all of our actions have an economic component to them.
Maybe at some point, and
Pretty much.
if you interpret economics very broadly as not finance, but.
Yeah.
Well, so the one connection there, so behavioral economics is very related to what I work on, and it's a really good example of what connects these two, because a lot of this work on non-material values is saying our traditional economic models and ways of representing reality aren't adequate. They aren't enough. They're useful in some contexts, they're helpful to organize things, but they aren't sufficient. And I think behavioral economics, the big argument, the way, at least how I summarize it, is humans aren't rational. And it's really economics saying, oh, these model we've been operating under this perfectly rational human is not true. Another analogy is that behavioral economics is essentially economists partnering up with psychologists to understand the way human brains actually work and how human behavior actually works. And I think this is an example of economists partnering up with other fields to say, actually, the tools that we have are not enough to represent the full picture here. And the same thing is happening with behavioral economics. It's like the tools we have aren't adequate to fully represent the human reality and the way we're operating. And yeah, and then this is definitely related to behavioral economics in terms of looking at those interactions between behavior and sort of deeper psychological aspects of it. Yeah.
I know that the project is still going on, but what are you finding with this coral project?
Yeah. Well, so there's sort of two ways I can answer that question. I can answer in terms of the actual kinds of values people are talking about, and I can also answer the sort of wonky question of how are we learning how to better represent multiple kinds of values alongside each other. Which, are you more interested in one or the other of those?
I'll be happy with whatever.
Okay, I'll say a little bit about each one. So in terms of the values people talk about, I have to say a lot of my work before this was in Hawaii, and I worked on the forest, but there's not people talk about land and water when you ask them about those things, and so I was not hugely surprised, but this is part of why people in these jurisdictions said, we can't just have monetary value, it's inadequate, because in Hawaii and American Samoa and Guam, in those three places in particular, the Pacific, there's a huge amount of discussion of identity and spirituality. So corals, for instance, in Hawaiian culture are seen as the first living things. So in the Hawaiian creation chant, they're the beginning. And so people are like, we can't even express how important these are. They're the foundation of everything, the foundation of our cell. And humans came way later. It's like there's this chain of the order, and humans are very far after corals. And so they're like, this is so important, so crucial. They're so central to our systems, very central to identity, heritage. There's a lot of really cool restoration projects going on that are very culturally integrated. So that's the kind of thing that we're working on representing. So there are a lot of very deeply rooted values. It's different in the Atlantic corals. There's less of that, but partly we are talking to cultures who've been there for less time. So there's a lot of complexity, social complexity there. on the wonky side, which is really interesting for us, like I think what we're learning is how, we're really practicing how in a context of, I'm working mostly with NOAA economists. So the people at NOAA who I'm like delivering this product to are economists. They're used to seeing that economic valuation. So it's been a really interesting conversation of how can we do this work and present this information in a way that is compelling and legitimate and rigorous and can somehow be combined with the economic work that you're doing. And we're not exactly sure how to do it, but it's a combination of using some narrative, we're using the concept of indicators, so we're counting things that can be counted that represent meaning, like numbers of artworks, numbers of books written, number of volunteers, volunteer hours, like things that represent meaning that kind of fit more within the framework. And so it's really exciting to try to take some of the things from this values assessment that were suggestions, like in theory, and actually try them in a product that's going to go to Congress to try to justify funding for coral reef conservation, for instance. Yeah.
You talked about sort of like ecosystem services being very sort of like focused on monetary valuations in the first years of sort of its upbringing.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like you are, or like you would like to see like more of a change in decision making also to appreciate non-monetary valuations, if I understood correctly, right? And I would totally agree. I was just wondering because like how I see it is that probably ecosystem services became as popular because it was possible for decision makers and policy makers to sort of put a monetary value on them and to sort of like put them against the economic values that might sort of like be be the benefits of other sort of actions. And I wonder whether you've got any ideas of sort of like, or how likely you think it is that sort of like also non-monetary valuations, which might be harder for policymakers to sort of like put into their models, how likely it is that that can become a thing?
Excellent question. I would say that's like one way of phrasing what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. It's very true. And this is sort of this tension that we run into all the time with, I think any effort to complexify, to reflect the real world more accurately is like harder to put into decision making because it's just messier, you know. And I think that you're absolutely right. That I think that part of the power of ecosystem services is that it can enter into this solitary metric, this single unit that allows comparison. It's the way decisions get made, absolutely. And so I'll answer that with the other thing that I would have mentioned here, the other project I'm really excited about is that, so the US government, since the 80s, has said that cost-benefit analysis has to be used to determine government actions. So Reagan executive order in the 80s said we have to use cost-benefit analysis to determine if we should or should not do something. So that's a mandate for federal agencies to use cost-benefit analysis. Now what's interesting is we think, of course, that means monetary valuation. But actually the guidance, and especially the most recent revision of the guidance of how to do this, actually says, here's what you should do in cost-benefit analysis. First, if you can monetize, you should always monetize. If you can't monetize, you should quantify. And if you can't quantify, you should qualitatively describe. You should describe the value. So there's this sort of hierarchy of, you can still use the cost-benefit sort of framework conceptually, even if you're not monetizing. And so one of the things that I've been working on here is trying to think about how to create more structures. So a structure like the economic valuation, it's not going to be the same in terms of having a single metric, but it'll be like economic valuation, that it does fit into a model. There is some model that they have, that policymakers have, that can fit this other kind of information. Because right now, you're right, there isn't really. Like if you just have cost-benefit analysis and you only use monetary value, then all this other stuff, it's not clear how it fits. But there's a lot of interest. So I actually got invited to a meeting. The US government is having a revamping of their cost-benefit analysis rules. They're reaching out to a bunch of academics to say, what's happening? Like, let's update what we're doing here to reflect current research. And I got invited to the meeting on ecosystem services. It was at the White House, which is very exciting. It wasn't in the West Wing, but it was right across the street. And I walked by Kamala's offices a lot of times before she was candidate. It was very exciting. But anyway, so I went there and the agencies basically said, we'd love to include these non-monetary values, but we don't have a system to do it. And so if you gave us like a way to do that in a more organized fashion, we would love to do that. So that's one of the things I'm working on, is trying to create some system to make it easier to bring them into policy, because I think what you said is totally true.
Yeah, one final question.
We have a student joining online who has a question. And I don't know.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead, Emilia.
Thank you. I just have a question. This has sort of come up in class a few times about sort of like climate action and what drives people to climate action and to do sort of things and engage in, quote, sustainable behaviors. So I'm wondering if you've done any work in terms of like ecological value and behaviors and climate action and looked at sort of that intersection at all.
Yes, great question. I can answer with actually the woman, Tricia Schrum, who I'm doing this Catalyst project with. We did a project where I'm gonna look though here because it's weird to look at the camera. So we did a big survey nationally, and we were interested in the relationship between exposure to extreme events, climate change, related extreme events, which like right now is really stressful. What's going on? It's like it's really happening right now in the southeastern U.S. And so exposure to those events and support for climate policy. And long story short, so we use economic methods. So I'm not against economic methods. So we did a willingness to pay sort of experiment and asked people how much they would be willing to pay using a series of gradations for climate policy. And long story short, we found that people who had experienced extreme events were willing to pay more money annually to support climate policy, about $100 more, which is actually kind of a lot if you aggregate that. And so it's not in exactly the way that your question was asked, but there is a relationship. And so this relates to the learning, is that clearly people are connecting extreme events. They've learned that extreme events are related to climate change, and they've learned that learning is connected to, well, if I've experienced this, I have a visceral understanding of what this means, and I'm more likely to do something about it. I think more generally, on the other thing I'll say is that like one of my students, Allison Adams, who just graduated, has worked on coral reefs in Hawaii and the degradation and values, and definitely found that awareness of the degradation, there's sort of this reaction that's sort of a resistance reaction that involves trying to protect the reefs, and not as much climate mitigation action, more climate adaptation action, but there was a connection between having values related to the reefs and taking action. I think there's a relationship, and I think it's a really ripe area for more work.
The last one from the class.
As somebody who, I moved from Florida, and I've noticed a response to climate events seems to create a community rhetoric of like resiliency, but it almost creates a desire to cling to old systems because that's comfort and we're strong and we'll stay here. And so I wonder like where that intersection between change in values after these kind of behavioral events, like when, I don't know, it's not linear. So
It's a really interesting question, and I mean, this is part of one of the things in this Behavior First project we're really interested in is the identity piece, and I think there's an element right now in this country, and Florida is a really good example of like the identity of being a Floridian may be wrapped up in not believing in climate change. That's part of the identity in a way that's very unique. I think historically is that there's a belief about a scientific finding that is connected to identity. And so that's part of where, as you said, super nonlinear and very complicated. And part of what we found here that was interesting is even when people, if they've experienced an extreme event, even if they said they didn't believe in human-caused climate change, it didn't matter. Like, they still were willing to pay more. That was not a relevant variable. So I think there's like, there's dissonance going on. Where you're like, and this is what we thought is like people, I have to say I don't believe in human-caused climate change because that's what my people believe. That's what people like me believe. But when it really comes down to it, actually I see a connection. And actually, if I've experienced this, like, seems like it makes sense for us to do something different. So I think thinking about capitalizing on that community and how can you think about identity and linking other aspects of identity to something that's more adaptive would be one way of thinking, like, okay, this yes, like strong, yes, identity, yes, we belong here, yes, and how can we move that into something that's more adaptive? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. I would say this is really critical to inclusion of these non-material values for our ecosystem services and inclusion within our environmental learning and education. Your work is really impactful and it will create some avenue to think and work on it in future. Thank you so much for coming and your time. Okay, now it's time for our another speaker, Dr. Brittany Mosier. Just 1 minute, please. Okay, well, let's welcome Dr. Brittany Mosier. Brittany Mosier is an assistant professor and going to be assistant very soon at the Rubinstein School. And Dr. Mosier obtained her BS degree from Cornell University and MS from the Montana State University and doctoral degree from the Colorado State University. And she also worked as a postdoc at the Pennsylvania State University. And her research focused on disease and population ecology, quantitative ecology, conservation decision making, herpetology, and conservation biology. So warm welcome to Dr. Brittany Mosier.
Right, just a moment. Hopefully folks online can see that. Please let us know if not. They can. Little pointers, I like to wander a little bit. Thanks everyone for having me. I appreciate being here and getting to chat with you. The first part of my talk, I wanted to just introduce myself so that we can get to know one another and we might know what my areas of expertise are, should they come in handy as you progress through your grad career. And then I wanted to zoom in a bit on one particular research project that we have going on that I think hits on a lot of elements of sustainability that maybe you've talked about in class. And we'll then do Q&A. I wanted to point out that also relevant to you in the grad program might be that I serve on the frozen computer. Okay. I serve on the Graduate Standards Committee, which is a Rubenstein committee that helps understand and create and communicate what the standards are for graduate education in our school. So that can include things like required courses, like that teaching and internship experience that you may have as a PhD student, what comprehensive exams might look like if they're required by your concentration. So just a note that if things come up where you have questions, please reach out on that topic. And then I'm now serving as the graduate program director. And so I hope to be in touch with many of you more as we pursue kind of some of the priorities that relate to graduate education. So a little catchphrase I like to use that defines the body of work that our team here at UVM does is decisions guiding research and research guiding decisions. And so I'm in the conservation realm, I'm in the wildlife and fisheries biology undergraduate program here, and most of my work relates to wildlife, like this spotted salamander that a previous undergrad student of mine photographed crossing a road. A quick shout out, don't be shy, Sam, don't be shy, Annabelle, to our team. This is our current team of graduate students. Anila, Sam, and Annabelle are in class, and Matt and Reed. And we work on a variety of topics, ranging, as Salim said, from population ecology of rare or endangered species to disease ecology, both zoonotic and non-zoonotic diseases that impact wildlife populations, to decision science. So by way of introduction, I want to talk first about this decisions guiding research side of things. One question that I find our group is asking, if you kind of zoom out to the macro level, is how can we coexist sustainably with wildlife populations, especially considering that our human populations are growing, are increasing in our demands, the demands we put on the environment, and globalization, so all that comes with that growing population. So just a snippet here from Matt Gorton's project. Matt is looking at how amphibian underpasses can help mitigate the challenges associated with increasing road rage. It's usually not road rage, it's killing the amphibians. Increasing roadways and increasing traffic, coinciding with these mass migration events that our amphibians make every spring here in Vermont. So figuring out if there's a way to balance those two a little bit better through road engineering, essentially. Here's a different study that's focused on disease. So here, what I and other authors were doing was trying to understand how the U.S. invoking the Lacey Act, which regulated import of amphibian species due to a threat of disease, how it actually worked. Was it effective in meeting the goal of having less risky salamander species entering the U.S. via the pet trade? And the graph, which we don't have to go into detail, essentially shows that it was successful for the salamander species that it covered, but it essentially had no effect on imports of other amphibian species like frogs. And unfortunately, we've now found that this pathogen we're worried about, that we thought was salamander specific, is not. So it just kind of is feeding into evaluating current actions, but then also potentially guiding future actions and future decisions. So I like to think about conservation decisions. I'm extremely motivated by thinking about decision makers and conservation practitioners and managers who are sort of tasked with deciding when it's time to act, how to act, and much of our research can support this kind of directly and indirectly. So I draw from the field of decision science. I'm going to talk some about that today. Ecology and also quantitative ecology to provide science that can support these decision makers. On the decision science side, some of the skills that our team has experience in is facilitation, so working with folks to really understand what motivates them, what their values are, what they're trying to achieve, understanding their objectives, and what other stakeholders should be part of this discussion. And then some kind of analytic techniques of value of information and optimization. This is just timber rattlesnake rattle. We do have timber rattlesnakes in Vermont. They're very rare. They're endangered. The ecological science side, so understanding drivers of population growth and decline, which are often the basis for the interventions that conservation decision makers are considering. And then modeling that allows us to make predictions about the future and how the future might look if we act in way A, if we act in way B, or if we don't act at all, which is a choice as well. So emphasizing that we can make some inferences about the future that might be helpful in informing what people decide to do today. And some of our work on this note has been in Voisin syndrome world. So I want to talk a little about Annabelle's project today because I think it brings together a lot of different threads. Certainly, it's one of the more complicated projects that I've been a part of. Sorry, Annabelle. At its very root, it's about a deer disease, right? Chronic wasting disease. That's a lethal disease of deer, so there's no recovery from it. It's caused by a misfolded protein called a prion. It's a neurological disease. And this disease is not in Vermont yet. However, it is as far east as Pennsylvania. So we started off working with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department as our primary stakeholder of interest. And the questions began, as they always do, simply. What are the concerns that the state has about chronic wasting disease coming to Vermont? Well, we assume when it's here, it's going to impact the number of healthy deer that we have. And that matters to us because we're the Fish and Wildlife Agency and we're supposed to be maintaining healthy populations of wildlife. It also matters to us because surely the sort of abundance of healthy animals is going to impact the number of hunters that we see in the state. And in many states, those hunting permits are really critical budget items that allow the state agency to do all the conservation work that they do for non-game species. And they said, oh, but there's a wrinkle. We wouldn't want to do anything that for deer, like targeting this maintaining healthy deer numbers, that might impact other species negatively. Because we're the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we're here to protect all species and their habitats. So we started off, okay, this this is a way to frame a problem. We understand what your goals are. But as we continued to work with them, it became clear that there was also this angle about food scarcity and the idea that as the disease potentially arrives in Vermont and spreads in prevalence and potentially impacts the abundance of hunters, well, there are lots of Vermonters who rely on this as a food source, a source of protein. And so that's a concern. But Vermont Fish and Wildlife said, but that's not really our jurisdiction. We're Vermont Fish and Wildlife. We do the fish and the wildlife and their habitats. And yeah, we're worried about food scarcity, but we don't know what to do about that. So entered Vermont Department of Health, who said, yeah, it's our job to think about food scarcity, and we've got a lot of ideas and concerns about this problem. We'd like to jump in. We also realized that as the number of healthy deer perhaps decrease, rural economies might be impacted. So there are lots of sort of local businesses that pop up around the hunting season in Vermont that actually play a big role in the Vermont economy. We've got taxidermists, we've got processors, we've got little corner stores where people come to check their game and buy a coffee and a sandwich. And that is a big part that folks are worried about. And again, Vermont Fish and Wildlife and Department of Health said, look, but that's not, we don't deal with that, we don't do that. In addition to just the money, there's the idea that in Vermont we actually have captive deer herds. Not just deer, but a few species of cervid, which could all potentially be impacted by chronic wasting disease. And Fish and Wildlife, surprisingly, does not regulate those either. So we realized we really needed the Agency of Ag, Food, and Markets to be on board, because they're the group that deals with both the captive herds and, to some extent, the thinking about rural economies. Well, it just has ballooned on and on from there. This is not a zoonotic disease, meaning there's no evidence so far that humans can be infected with chronic wasting disease. At the same time, there's a lot of concern that it could become zoonotic. So in places where chronic wasting disease is rampant, the CDC suggests that everyone tests their game, and if your animal tests positive, that you don't consume the meat. So there is this whole messaging and communication piece that also emerged. Even though that's the CDC guidance, Vermont Fish and Wildlife said, gosh, it really doesn't feel like it's our role to tell the public what they should or should not eat. That's just going to get us into a bunch of questions that we're not qualified to answer. So we were sort of back to Department of Health on that one as well. And just to point out, when we think about health of wildlife or fisheries, health of humans, and health of agricultural assets, livestock, etc., we're really thinking about what are called these One Health problems, where we recognize that the health of these different systems are kind of inextricably connected, and that in some cases, the most effective responses that you can mount really rely on coordination across multiple agencies. So that's definitely the way that this project is going. I'll just point out that I ran out of room to include other things, but now we have USDA APHIS on board, who would be involved in the event of Vermont deciding to do any culling of animals. So if the disease was detected in a particular area and they thought they could get on top of it really quickly by removing animals or reducing density, USDA would be on board. And then Vermont Forest Parks and Recreation, the U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System would all be involved to potentially help deal with carcasses of infected animals, to provide additional sources for surveillance, to provide additional check stations on their properties, and to potentially, in the case of the Forest Service, to do forest management activities that might cause deer to stop aggregating and kind of break up one of those sources of transmission. I think that's what I wanted to cover here, is just the fact that, you know, we can start with a simple population or disease ecology problem, but if we're really trying to think about it holistically and we're trying to be creative about the ways that folks could intervene on a problem, almost certainly we start to involve other partners and we start to involve other dimensions of sustainability beyond just having sustainable or self-sustaining healthy wild populations. I thought this highlighted that well. Before I take your questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about myself and my motivation for doing science. So I have just, I don't know why exactly, but from a pretty young age have just recognized that the people out there who are making decisions about natural systems, about wildlife populations, have a really challenging job. We rarely know everything. Sometimes it feels like we rarely know anything that might help them make their decision, and they have to consider other pieces of the puzzle, right? Wildlife may be in their name, but their mission typically includes people. And so most of the work in my lab is projects that were sort of designed with our partners in resource management agencies to understand what are these scientific uncertainties that are stopping you from being able to make a good decision, or in the case that Annabelle and I are working on, sometimes the question is about the decision itself. How do we even go about a process for finding a pathway to a decision when things are so complicated? So that has always motivated me. I'm someone that likes being outside, that likes recreating in the outdoors, and I don't know, maybe that's where it began. But in any event, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning is knowing that my work is hopefully making someone else's job a little bit easier, that it's contributing toward this decision process. And then I also have a little one, so thinking about what we're leaving behind certainly also motivates me. Thinking about the experiences that I've had and whether those same experiences will be available to people 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, I find deeply motivating. That's a summary of big picture, who I am, what motivates me, what I do, and I would love to open it up for questions and conversation. Thanks.
Questions, comments?
I'll just add a potential complication to your very complicated chronic wasting disease. I've been talking with a friend working in Minnesota who's studying prion transition in soils and water, which then leads to potential other human mistakes that we don't understand well. So I'm wondering if that's entered the discussion.
It hasn't entered the discussion from a public health standpoint yet. It has entered sort of on the ecology and modeling side that, so Anne's point, the prions can be shed in deer fluids of many kinds, saliva, urine, etc. Carcasses that degrade on the ground and they can persist in water or soil potentially for decades. So it's not something that leaves when the deceased deer leave. And that's a good point, that humans might encounter this pathogen in other ways other than just eating game. And that is potentially scary. Anna?
Can you explain what bioinformation analysis is? I think you had that on an earlier slide.
Annabelle! Annabelle asked if I could explain what value of information analysis is. I'm laughing because Annabelle knows what this is. But this is probably like one of those fun moments where I get to be doing the comps and the questioner. Value of information, I think it's important for everyone to know about because I use it in my life. Value of information analysis essentially looks at uncertainties and says, is it actually critical to resolve this uncertainty to be able to make a decision? We see this sort of anchoring with management agencies a lot where they say, oh, we just, it's too complicated. We can't act because we don't know this thing. This is an analysis that essentially says, what if we knew that thing? What if we knew that thing with certainty? What would your decision be then? It's possible that resolving that uncertainty doesn't actually influence the decision that you make. I guess I'm thinking about when I run into this in personal life. I don't know, I just don't like uncertainty, so I'll be like, I need to ask a few more people about this, I still don't understand this. If I can just play the game of, okay, let's say the uncertainty is resolved and this is the answer. What would I choose? Now let's say it was resolved and this other thing is the answer. What would I choose? A lot of times it's the same thing. And that just tells me that my decision is robust to this uncertainty. And it also means you don't need to spend the time and energy it takes to resolve that. It's kind of, for me, in personal life, it's often a stalling tactic. For the agency side, it's more because this is complicated and it feels like a big deal most of the time. It feels like something that we need to resolve before we can act. But this is an analysis method that can help us understand quantitatively, is that really true, that it's worth the time to resolve this? Does that make sense? You probably see it all the time now that I've said it, like in your own life.
That's how you attack the analysis paralysis.
That's how you attack the analysis paralysis. Yeah, I'm just thinking like, your roommate says, you want to go out to dinner tonight? And you say, sure. And they say, where do you want to go? And you say, oh, I don't care, you pick. And they say, well, I'm between these two things, but first I need to make sure that both of them are open and that there's parking available and that this and that. It might be that there's really just one of them that you're going to anchor. You're interested in having pizza for dinner, and it really doesn't matter if you have to walk an extra 2 blocks because of parking. That's just your choice. So you can go through this rigmarole of the deep dive on resolving some elements of uncertainty, but it can be a real drain on resources, and often there's another cost associated with time till action, right? So we say, oh, it'll take us 5 years to design a study to resolve this uncertainty, and that means CWD is going to be here, or it's going to be 5 years closer to being here. There's also a cost there that has to be considered. Other questions? Kaylee.
Yeah, so I do a lot of work also really interested in the quantitative side and in doing applied research, and I was wondering if you could speak on how you take a potentially really complex ecological problem like a disease ecology model or a population model and make that something that's really easy to present and be understandable to not only like a Fish and Wildlife Department, but other agencies, the public, all these other stakeholders who might have an interest that are not going to have a clue what I'm talking about if I start going, oh yeah, I built an occupancy model based on GIS data.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a challenge because you want to give enough that you sort of firmly establish that there's a lot of expertise and thought that went into this, that it wasn't something, that you just created, without it feeling like a black box, which scares people. Like, we don't know what's in that box, so how can we be making this decision that is tied to something that can't be easily explained? So strategically, I use a lot of conceptual diagrams to start. I think it's that's where like most of the feedback honestly comes from, and that's most of the time what I'm wanting to convey to people is that this is our view of how the world works. Do you think it works the same way? And they're like, no, I think there's a different box that goes between those two words that you put there. Like that informs my modeling. But they don't need to be looking at my R code to understand that, right? So I think using diagrams and that sort of thing as a communication tool is a good first step. And then maybe kind of in a narrative form describing the key characteristics that your model has. First for an occupancy model, let's say we're studying, I don't know, salamander, of course, that's really cryptic, and that we can all agree on. And so then you can say, well, what you need to know about my model is it accounts for the fact that sometimes when we look for this thing, we don't find it, not because it's absent, but because we just missed it. And so making sure that those pieces are clear, they don't need to see the likelihood that actually processes that in the model, but I think it is useful to show that you're hearing them when they come up with sticking points and that you can respond like, yes, I've built that into the model in this way.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moser, for your insightful talk and sharing your ideas and your research. I would say it is really important that disease ecology and conservation biology decision-making process is critical for envisioning a sustainable future. Thank you so much, and huge round of applause. If you have further questions, you can meet Dr. Moser in her office at her convenience. Okay, I have 1 or 2 minutes. I know it's a long class. Is there holding? Yeah, please. Can you please share your announcement? 1 minute.
I realize this falls in line on the same day that there's a Resmer event.
Yeah.
But I'm leading this event at work at Patagonia downtown. It's free. There's probably going to be beer and snacks. But an author is going to present about his new book, which doesn't actually hit bookstores until November. So you get early access to purchase it and get it signed. But he talks about exploring the Arctic and just the adoration that comes with that, but also recognizing all of the climate change effects that he sees. So if you're available, I encourage you to come.
Thank you. So if you can manage your time, you can join over there. So our next week plan is you have to, your seminar 2 is there in our next class. So I am planning to cover half an hour or 40 minutes for the rest of my discussion about the social ecological systems resilience. And then we will start our presentation afterwards. So you'll get same rubric and the same structure, but I add 2 more minutes for discussion and concern. So a 6-minute presentation, 6-minute question and answer. So your group is there. Is there anyone who did not find your group? Okay, you got it. Is this on TeamFind? You are there?
I know, I've got my group. I was just wondering, so you're going to talk 40 minutes about other stuff and then we're still going to do the group presentations?
Yeah.
But that's not, like, is it again 6 groups? Because then it would be quite...
So 10, 12 minutes, so it will take 72 minutes.
Okay, all right.
So we will have 2 hours class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Okay. So please meet your group at your convenience and develop your presentation. So I assigned 1 article, but you have to add another relevant article with that. More is better. So that's all. If you have any question, anything concern, please shoot me an email, or we'll try to our best to respond to as soon as possible. Thank you so much. See you next week.